Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. Before we get started, I'd just like to mention a new podcast I've started, the World War II podcast. In the first episode, I talked to Paul Hilditch of the Northern World War II Association about the German half-track. For more information, you can go to www.podcast.com. There you'll find links for iTunes and Facebook and everything else. Okay, so in this episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast, we look at Volume 8, Issue 4, The Ancient World's Fragile Giant, the Seleucid Empire at War. To discuss the topic, I'm joined by Josho Brouwers, Marc McCaffery and Marc DeSantis. With the death of Alexander the Great, his empire descended into the Wars of Succession. The Seleucid Empire rose from this. Could someone tell us about the rise of Seleucus and the foundation of the empire?
In terms of the origins of Seleucus, Seleucus starts out, we think, as possibly one of the pages that it grows up with Alexander. There's no firm proof of that. I don't really think it's more a supposition that, well, he ends up becoming a commander in a fairly serious position, even though he only appears sort of halfway through Alexander's campaigns. But appearing as he does in the position that he has, in a major, how can I say, leading a major infantry brigade, he has to have been brought up in the same system, because going on the Macedonian traditions, any commanders, be they in the armies of Philip, Alexander, or the successors later on, go along the system of a page system, where boys are designated as the companions of the heir apparent, brought up with him in an educational system, and thereby designated for future roles in his administration as trusted members of his, well, in terms of the Alexander and Philip groups, they are of course the companions. Later on, when we talk about the later Hellenistic dynasts, they are referred to as the friends, the Philoi. But of course, somehow Seleucus has to come from that group originally. We've got a couple of names that are thrown around as to his father maybe being a general in Philip's army, perhaps, but where he actually first comes to the fore is really by the time that Alexander has sort of moved through across into Asia, Central Asia, gone through a number of his major battles, and Seleucus comes to the forefront mostly really as a leader of the Hypaspists, and in particular his name is mentioned at the crossing of the Jaxartes and the battle against Porus, and he's in there as a major commander there. But it's more so that when you get to the after the death of Alexander, that he's mentioned in there, going to pray at one of the temples overnight for the help for Alexander, but then afterwards at the actual settlements, and he appears there as a major player, and eventually as part of those settlements of who's going to command what in the aftermath of Alexander's death. He is there as a chiliarch, a very senior commander under the, or at the side, of Perdiccas, the main man really amongst the initial group of successors. So his rise is a little bit shaded in, how can I say?
It's a bit of a mystery.
It's a bit of a mystery, but he must come from the aristocracy.
Yeah, almost certainly. Otherwise, he would never have risen up as highly as he did, especially not in Macedonia, which was in many ways a lot more traditional than the rest of Greece. Even according to Athenians, the Macedonians weren't even Greeks as such. They were like half barbaric, because they had these strange primitive customs. They had kings that were allowed to marry multiple wives, and they had this very Homeric style aristocracy that derived ancestry from Heracles. There are also ties with Achilles, with Alexander, etc., etc. So it was a very peculiar system, but very rigid. It seems in most cases. So Seleucus must have come from some sort of high-ranking group.
How did he manage to found the empire? It's a big piece of a geographical land they managed to get himself in charge of.
It was the biggest eventually, but what it starts out as is his hold on Babylon rests primarily to start with him following the examples of a number of other satrapy leaders, that he ingratiates himself with the local population. And although his initial hold on Babylon is only over a very relatively short time, and he very quickly gets sort of ejected out of there after Antigonus actually gets involved in the area, and Antigonus comes through chasing Eumenes in some of the initial wars of the successors, and then comes back to exert his influence over Central Asia. He kicks out Seleucus from Babylon, but being able to get back into Babylon later on with the help of Ptolemy, it's a very hit and miss affair. There's no guarantee that he's going to be able to get back in there, and he is, I think, in a lot of the books on this period, the word unlikely comes up, linked with Seleucus. Really, when you put him up against all of the other successors of this early period, and successors / prominent dynasts as they turn out to be, his hold over this area is a lot of luck involved.
Yeah, of all the successor kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire is the most fragile one by far, because it's Ptolemy has Egypt. The others have control of Macedonia, later Pergamon, and Seleucus is sort of saddled with the Middle East, which was always a bit of a problematic area back in ancient times as it is today. So it was a struggle to keep everything together. Also, once it had grown.
If in modern day terms, where are we talking about?
Iraq, Syria, large parts of Turkey, bits of Iran.
Extends over into Afghanistan and Pakistan, and up into Armenia, and sort of into, I think it's Tajikistan, isn't it? North of Afghanistan there. It goes into now. But I mean, that sort of area sort of comes and goes throughout the Seleucid period. I mean, you've got what is ancient Bactria and Sogdiana, and those upper satrapies as such. They do sort of come in and out, and I think it's more the Seleucid relationships with some of the guys who are put in charge as satraps in those areas that influence that coming and going as well.
Yeah, some of those frontier zones are a little bit fluid, because it's very much it depends on how the absolute the control is that the Seleucids have over those areas, and that tends to be a little bit it comes and it goes, basically. Depends very much on the local leaders also.
The Bactrian province, as well as the Indian territories that Alexander conquered, those were the first to actually separate from the Seleucid territories and establish their own kingdoms in their own right, in their own civilization.
It's a huge melting pot of people. What was his military model? Did he try and copy the Macedonian way of fighting, or did they take what they had and work with what they had, locally, natively, or was it mix and match?
It goes along very much the Macedonian model. I mean, as he goes back, the first thing that he does is pick up a number of silver shields, the elite of the Macedonian Hypaspes, taking them into his army early on, and that sort of tradition continues on. This idea of, even though Alexander's army, of course, the main body of infantry are traditionally Macedonians, as the Seleucids go on, out of sheer necessity. Obviously, they're taking on populations, from within their territories and training them in a Macedonian style. But it is still a recognisably Macedonian army. But of course, with, how can I say, fringe benefits when you start including elephants and chariots as something to differentiate you from all the other Macedonian armies running around the place.
Yeah, and a lot of the more localized leaders, so from the other satrapies, if you will, would have had their been able to raise their own armies also. Sometimes the Macedonians are, but more often, I guess, also in more local variations. So it must have been eclectic on the whole, I think. But there was, of course, the Macedonian Greek top layer, which was basically the whole elite, that sort of became dominant, especially in the Near East.
I was wondering if anyone thought that war elephants were worth the trouble. They had an enormous logistical cost. They could rampage if when wounded. What do you think about that?
I think it was a must-have for a lot of these armies because it was like the partly status, but partly also sort of keeping up with the modern technology of the other armies. That once Alexander sort of brings that element into the Hellenistic / Greek model of an army, it's not having elephants in your army is going to put you maybe behind or maybe just lessen an impact in your enemy's eyes, because you are going up against such a similar army who are looking at you saying, are you matching Alexander's standards?
This was also the era when the Hellenistic kingdoms began developing the super-sized polyremes, the big war galleys, and that in many ways is partly driven by status, the desire, but they were also very useful. And I think that perhaps these elephants were useful too. I've often wondered if they were so useful, why they ultimately disappeared from most armies. Is it just that they couldn't get them anymore, or was it that they developed means to counter them?
I think for the most part, I would say that, at a guess, is that they weren't as useful as everybody thought they might be. And I think that maybe at some point there was also kind of the idea everybody has these elephants, so it's no longer really special. And like you said, elephants, they're big, they need a lot of food, and they're difficult to control, especially on a battlefield. Horses already are very difficult to control because horses also are herbivores, herd animals. They have a tendency to run away from anything that is pointy and and dangerous. And elephants have that trouble too. And there are lots of stories where the elephants, it's basically sort of like Russian roulette. Will the elephants run towards the enemy, or will they get scared, turn around, and trample our own men on the way out from wherever they need to go? So I don't know. The war elephants, they make a lasting impression. And when you think of ancient warfare, a lot of people would say that war elephants are a fixture in that. But I think they were only used for about 100 years or something in armies. Relatively short in any case. I don't remember exactly the...
I think I came across something recently saying that there was some use of war elephants in the 1st century BC by the Romans. I can't think of what battle it was, but I came across that, and that struck me as, well, they were still using them. They did get trotted out occasionally for that, but certainly their heyday is that Hellenistic period between Alexander and down to the end of the demise of the Seleucids, really.
I wonder if the the Indians, or where the elephants were coming from, they had a longer, they had more access, so they had a longer use.
Well, but the Phoenicians aren't actually using Indian elephants.
No, they're using African.
North African forest elephants, which eventually die out because of their use in warfare and also by the Romans in the amphitheaters and whatnot. But it's the Hellenistic armies. Pyrrhus does use the Indian elephants as well. But mostly the Hellenistic armies use the Indians, and they are supposedly not able to breed them necessarily successfully in their programs, and therefore have to replenish their stocks occasionally.
Elephants are very slow breeders also, and it takes a while for a baby elephant to grow up to be useful as a war elephant. So it's a much bigger investment than, for example, buying horses, since young foal grow up fairly quickly. So it's not as expensive or as time consuming. It's usually easier to capture Indian elephants than it is to rear them in captivity. So there was the same also. So it's very much might also be a supply issue partially, but I also think that they just weren't as useful on the whole
Do we know how they organised the elephant corps, the elephant forces?
They're organised. I think there's one of the information in one of the articles that was published in this edition was talking about units being in
32 or 64. Combinations of these are found in most Seleucid battles. This is in the article by Dennis Piccolo.
Each one supported by light infantry.
Yeah, 40 or 50 infantry supporting each elephant, which is, it's a fair commitment, as well as actually feeding them 250 pounds of food each day.
I wonder if you needed a minimum amount to stand there so they looked like a solid wall. They're a bit like a nuclear weapon. You have them, but you don't really want to use them.
Oh, the numbers of the elephants are always relatively small. I mean, there's... There is one.
There's 500 elephants or so on the battlefield.
But it's still compared to, for example, the infantry or the cavalry. It's a relatively small number. They make it up for in mass, I guess.
Maybe we should take our lead from the Romans, perhaps. The fact that all the war elephants that they captured in the Punic Wars, they simply took to the amphitheaters in order to use them as entertainment rather than actually add them to their own armies.
Yeah, I don't think the Romans never used the elephants in their armies, did they? As far as I know.
Yeah, I think they did. And I mean, you've got, of course, the famous incident of Claudius in his invasion of Britannia, turning up for the song and dance at the end of the surrender of the kings of Britannia, and of course he brings over a couple of war elephants to parade with his army.
It comes back to showmanship, possibly, as Mark was saying. Ships get bigger. They're not always as more super useful, but due to the size. But they look the business. They project power, which could be what elephants do. And you put them in the Colosseum, and they project power, don't they? Even though they're bound to fail.
Yeah, of course. It must have been a terrifying sight to see a few dozen elephants charging down towards your lines. Definitely, as far as terror tactics are concerned, there would have been something.
But of course, the Macedonians quickly come up with their strategies for dealing with those elephants, and it's. I mean, you sort of question the usefulness of them, but also how useful are they when they've got big caltrops that they're throwing out before their armies, spike strips and whatnot that they deploy in order to actually stop charges happening. This sort of these tactics are taken up fairly early on in the use of the elephants.
In theory, you'd have thought the elephant is the killer phalanx buster of its day.
Yeah, that's what they sometimes say, that they refer to elephants as the tank on the ancient battlefield and that sort of stuff. It's sort of similar like the scythe chariots that one of which is also depicted on the cover of this issue, of course. That when they say that these were like tanks on the battlefield, and both scythe chariots and elephants were considered these very effective weapon systems, but in reality it's sort of to be doubted. At least as far as the sources are concerned, it seems like they're not as effective, but the emphasis as always is very much on the infantry, so it's always a matter of question of whether or not the sources are telling the entire story, because the ancient sources, the deciding factor is always the heavy infantry, or the light infantry, and the cavalry and the elephants and the chariots or whatever. It's always sort of a sideshow that takes place aside from the main battle. It's always the heavy infantry that's usually considered decisive. So you also have to sort of question what the sources, if they are entirely reliable or not, whether there is some sort of bias in that also.
We've mentioned chariots twice. Do we want to have a look briefly at the chariots before the Romans outmaneuvered them all at Magnesia?
It seems to me that chariots were more trouble than they were worth, because they were relying on a weapon that you stuck on a chariot the size to actually do the damage, and as far back as Gaugamela, the Macedonians had hit upon a solution to avoid that. It would seem that it was a scary weapon, but disciplined troops could stand up to it.
Yeah, it's basically the same story as with the elephants. If you open up your ranks and you trap the thing and you murder the animals or the drivers or the people on board, whatever. It's basically neutralized. It seems like both elephants and chariots have the same sort of prestige sort of thing going on, and the same importance as far as frightening the enemy is concerned. But if the enemy aren't frightened and they stand their ground and they're disciplined and they manage to use tactics to sort of disarm the weapon, it's fairly easy to take them down as far as the sources are concerned. So yeah.
It also relies on your armies, or sorry, your enemies actually playing into your hands. I mean, we've got references to the Persians arriving, picking their battlefields days before and making sure that they've cleared land that is able to be flat and useful for the chariots to run on, and then sitting and waiting for their enemies to sort of come and arrive at their picked location. It's down to, and a lot of the time the elephants are the same sort of thing, that depending on the terrain, they can be absolutely useless if you pick the right terrain.
Yeah, but that's what military commanders do most of the time, of course. Pitched battles are basically almost anomalous as far as it's concerned, because a pitched battle is only fought when both commanders think that they can have some sort of advantage on that field of battle. For example, when the Persians landed at Marathon, they thought, this is ideal cavalry ground, we can deploy our cavalry here. And it's the same every time, with two generals deciding this is the perfect spot for our armies to maneuver and to outsmart the enemy. And it's only in those occasions that you can actually have, one of these set-piece battles with these armies maneuvering against each other. That were probably much more rare than we usually assume. Most battles would have been sieges and encounter meeting engagements and that sort of stuff, rather than pitched battles.
Pre-meeting Rome, how successful was the Seleucid army?
That's a bit of that's the perennial question, because it's always the Macedonian army, once it runs into the Roman manipular legion or whatever, it usually the assumption is always, well, the Romans were superior because their formation was better articulated, so more flexible than the Macedonian phalanx, etc., etc. So the Roman system was obviously superior, but there's always the question in the back of your mind whether it's also has to do with the leadership. In that particular case, if Alexander had been in command of those Macedonian armies when they faced up to the Romans, would the outcome have been the same or not? For example, with the Battle of Pydna or whatever, if Alexander had been there, would he not have come up with another solution, and would they have not been victorious over the Romans? That sort of stuff. So that's always a bit of a problem, I think.
But they're vastly different tactics that are being used. If you take Alexander's Macedonian army, where he's using his phalanx blocks, technically, but his Macedonian phalanx blocks as sort of the pivotal force, and then using his very large cavalry units to actually pick the gaps and actually exploit the gaps and whatnot. And then you sort of move from that idea through to the later Alexander models when he's in Central Asia, and he's having to change his tactics into something more of a, how can I say, reacting to the guerrilla warfare that he's going to encounter in Bactria and against the Indian tribesmen. And then later on, you then go to the successor period where they each have their token Macedonian phalanxes still, but they're using smaller units of cavalry and whatnot, and then trying to supplement that with their other forms of troops that they're bringing in to supplement, and then also their, how can I say, their feature weapons of the elephants and chariots and whatnot. It's a very different balance of an army that's coming to force in the later period, and I think the Seleucid army is very well tailored to actually fight against the Ptolemaic armies, etc. I mean, they make a good pairing as such, and you have this war after war between the two of them because they can match each other as such. It's when you sort of bring something different into the mix that they can't handle it, because they've got so used to this style of the late successor period.
Polybius always he said that the phalanx was superior to the legion under the right conditions, which was if it had level ground which to roll over a Roman legion. Usually the Romans did their best to avoid giving them that. Cynocephaly was fought amongst hills, some low hills. Is the ultimate victory, I wonder, of the legion over the phalanx based on the choice of terrain? That if the Romans had had to fight on level ground, might they have lost? And is it a testament to their better leadership, better generalship, that they avoided that kind of confrontation? That they didn't give the Macedonians or the Seleucids the chance to fight them on terrain of that would be to their benefit, that they're choosing?
Yeah, that's always been my idea a little bit. That's why I said, if there had been a commander of the caliber of Alexander, he might not have let the Romans dictate terms in such a particular way, I think.
I think that Alexander, he was always one step ahead of the enemy, and that was not the case with the Seleucids. And when I think about the Seleucids, I wonder, when they finally came to their confrontation with the Romans, did they ever really have a chance? It just seems like the Roman army of the 190 was the superior army as it stood. But is that simply just 2020? Hindsight is 2020, and could Antiochus, for example, have defeated them?
He comes against the Romans at a really bad time for him, really, because he's coming up against them after the end of the Second Punic War. It's the time when the Romans, in all that period, that is the time when they have been most battle ready, and you've got a huge number of veterans who are continually in the ranks at that period of time. The Romans have gone from being that semi-part-time army that's called up in their levies every year, to being now that professional army that the Macedonian-style armies have been for years and years, but maybe have been losing that edge as they go through into the later successor periods. And so I think it is. Given the right circumstances, the Macedonian army would certainly have been a match for the Roman legions, except for this, just the background of what had been happening to both of those systems of fighting at that time in history.
That is my understanding too. From what I have read, the Roman consuls, when they would go to do battle in the east, they specifically looked for old veterans of Scipio Africanus to take into their own armies, men who had been battle-hardened after years of fighting in Spain and Africa. And if you have trained men like that fighting in your ranks against relatively inexperienced soldiers, certainly the Romans had an advantage there.
They must have had faith in the way that they were fighting as well, though, because if they thought, okay, we're better men, but you know what, their tactics are better than us, and their kit's better than us, but we've won the day because we're better, you would have thought they would have copied some of what the opposition were doing.
I've thought hard about what the Roman advantage was relative to other soldiers in other armies, and it's difficult for me to believe that they were better fighters in terms of pure aggression, what have you. But the Roman legionary system, it did, because it was more flexible, gave an individual soldier more room in which to swing his sword, utilize his weapons. It seems that they allowed the individual soldier more chance to kill more efficiently than the bunched up soldiers in the phalanx, which had mass on its side. But most soldiers in the phalanx were not actually fighting in the direct sense of using their weapons against the enemy. It also seems that the Romans, because they were able to somehow replenish their ranks, withdraw companies, centuries, and maniples, would put fresh soldiers into the line. And it seems that in terms of fighting a battle, the Roman legion was more efficient and overall more effective.
Alexander the Great definitely had that ability to change the formation of his army and fight in the different styles and react to the different styles that he's actually facing up against. And I think that ability to adapt is lost as soon as you get into the successor period. They go back to more rigid style. So if you want to say, take Alexander against the Romans, certainly I think his adaptability would definitely have been any match for the Romans. But it's not that case when you get to, by the time that Macedonian armies do get in contact with the Romans, they're back to a very, stock standard fighting style that they can't adapt to anything, and they've got used to fighting other Hellenistic armies, which has made it worse.
Yeah, fighting other people with the same armies as well as maybe more primitive peoples, or more primitive in quotes. When they come up against the Romans, who also have this characteristically Roman tenaciousness and this seemingly inexhaustible supply of manpower, it poses them a gigantic problem, basically.
I think, Josho, that's the hidden ingredient in all of this. The Romans had an enormous supply of manpower that it's often overlooked. If we take what Polybius said about it, he said that the Romans had about 700,000 men between itself and its allies in Italy that it could call upon, and I think 70,000 cavalry was it. That's an enormous population advantage, and I think that ultimately that's what saw them through the First Punic War, the Second Punic War, and gave them the ability to go fight against Macedon and the Seleucid Empire immediately on the heels of defeating Carthage at the end of the Second Punic War.
Definitely, because with the Punic Wars, you can see that they have all these major defeats, and there's thousands of Romans dead, and yet they bring more legions onto the field, and it must have been very frustrating. It's like fighting the Hydra. For every head that you cut off, 2 new ones spring up. It's impossible to fight the Roman army at this period.
Is that the difference between fighting a Republican army, where every individual man is expected to do his part, as opposed to the army of dynastic empires, where you're a professional soldier and patriotism is not a factor? Did people care about the Seleucid Empire if you were a subject of the Seleucid Empire?
I wouldn't be thinking so. I think you've got such a... By that stage, these professional armies who are stationed for years on end, especially around the dynasties themselves, moving from location to location. You've got military bases, certainly, but they're not taking from necessarily the local population.
I hadn't thought about that as such, that the Romans might have this sort of will to fight in defense of their countries that the successor armies might not possess.
They've got also a different aim with their warfare, though, the Romans. They've got this attitude that they will, they're fighting, they're taking on a war, is going to lead, through their experience at least, to a settlement whereby an enemy bows down to them and actually submits, and then takes a submissive role in any other future conflicts. The Greeks and the Hellenistic dynasts have not got that same attitude. They have got this idea that wars will finish in a settlement being reached. After you've had the battle, you will then come to the negotiating table. And the Romans have not got that idea as an option. So you've got 2 different mentalities going against each other.
The Hellenistic kings were fighting an 18th century style of war, and the Romans were like Napoleon. They were there to win, and they would keep fighting until they won. That's what I think gave them the staying power in most of their wars. And when you think about the nature of patriotism among the Romans and how they could raise seemingly soldiers after endless, bloody, horrific defeats. Think what it was like when, at the end of the empire, when the Rome fell, and they were struggling to find any kind of troops and they had to induct barbarian Federates into their armies. Things had changed.
I wonder if we should look at Battle of Magnesia, which is really the real nail in the coffin, the turning point for the Seleucid Empire against the Romans. And we've got chariots, elephants, unwieldy phalanxes. We've got the whole lot, which kind of is the case study for everything we've really been talking about. I wonder if someone could just give us a brief overview.
Has anybody been reading about the Battle of Magnesia in detail?
Who do you think was in command of the Roman army at Magnesia? Was it Lucius Cornelius Scipio, or is it his brother Scipio Africanus?
It's Lucius.
No, it's Lucius Cornelius.
Scipio Africanus is apparently there, or sorry, he was on the campaign.
Right.
But for some reason he's sick.
Right. That's what they said, and I wonder if that was a cover story.
There's the story that maybe he was able to take the field, but he had decided, well, a combination of factors. Perhaps he had actually stepped aside so that any victory at that point would not, deter from his brother's reputation. There's also the fact that after the defeat of Hannibal, the next couple of things that Scipio gets involved in aren't raging successors, really, and he'd been slated a bit in terms of politics in Rome at the same time. So it's a bit doubtful as to how much backing he would have had as the leader of the army, whether he was the best man to actually incite the troops to a victory, or whether his brother, with a little less history behind him, might be able to do a better job.
This was the era when the Philhellenism, Scipio Africanus represented the increasing penetration of Greek culture into Rome, which Cato hated. Cato hated Africanus because he was that person who preferred the Greek lifestyle, Greek culture. And so even as the Romans were defeating the Greeks, the Romans were afraid that Greek culture was defeating them. And they were right. It did defeat them. They became ultimately Hellenized just as every other people in the ancient world in that era did.
But at the same time, Scipio is like for Cato, the epitome of the breaking down of the Roman system in reaction to the Hannibalic War. That you've had all these younger, the average age of these leaders coming through is anything but your standard approach to electing generals and whatnot from Roman political circles. And Cato is struggling to get back to what is traditional in Roman society at the time.
I think that Scipio was only 24 when he took over in Spain. Is that correct?
Yeah,
that's
young man. That's
very
correct.
Young man.
Yeah, I think he's aged 30. Is 30 or 32 when he gets consulship for the first time.
So the only other point I had really with the war with Rome was Hannibal had sought refuge in the Seleucid court of Antiochus the Great. He's renowned for being one of the greatest generals of antiquity.
That's the ironic thing, that you've got this battle taking place and you've got two of the guys who are said to be the greatest generals around in the ancient world at the time sitting on the sidelines at the same time. You've got Hannibal having had a recent small minor defeat, and of course Antiochus loses faith in him and puts him on the back burner. And at the same time, you've got on the other side, for whatever reason, Scipio Africanus sitting this one out, and that is the end of it. They are in the same theatre of war after all the great things that happened during the Punic War, where you've got these amazing, two amazing meetings of minds as such, with Scipio and Hannibal coming together not once but twice to have personal conferences with each other, discussing their tactics and whatnot, and yet they're by respective sides just pushed to one side. They're not needed. The world has moved on.
Do we know what Hannibal might have suggested, or what his tactics his advice was?
His tactics for the defence of the coastal defences was to make a stand and keep the Romans out of actually taking control of the ports. And of course, because I think of some of his, or that one initial setback, that advice is let go of, and the Romans are allowed to take control of some of those ports, get a foothold as such in Seleucid territory.
I think I've been through all my sort of notes of bits and pieces. I just wondered if anyone had any other points.
Was it a failure of political imagination that the Hellenistic kings, the Hellenistic empires, fought each other for so long and allowed Rome to establish itself to the point where Rome could come after them and eat their lunch one day? I wonder just how much prescience anybody can have to expect some Italian city-state to grow from small beginnings to being the master of Italy and then the entire Mediterranean.
After what Macedon actually does, I mean, taking Philip taking a bunch of goat herds supposedly and turning them into the finest army that Greece had ever witnessed come charging down out of the north. Certainly, if you want to do that to Macedon, you can certainly do it in Italy as well.
In many ways, Macedonia is perhaps less likely to have achieved what it did. It was astonishing.
Well, if you believe the 5th century Greeks and how they sort of style the Macedonians, especially when you get pictures of the Macedonians throughout the Peloponnesian War when they get involved, it is really these backwards people from the north. And then 100 years later, that's all turned around greatly, hasn't it? But also Rome, I should say, its power base stays in one place the entire time. Whereas when you talk about the Hellenistic kingdoms, power bases shift all the time throughout the Hellenistic period. It goes from Macedon, it moves across. You've got the rise of Babylon being a center of power. Then, of course, the Seleucid power moves back to the Mediterranean, to that eastern shore of the Mediterranean. You've got, at one stage, you've got a quick rise of power in Thrace, as out of being this, the backwards corner of of the Greek world. All of a sudden, it's a player in the Hellenistic world. But then, you lose there's no real dynasty that's established there after Lysimachus, and then of course it sort of sinks back into the background again. There's a real shift of power back and forth over time, whereas the Romans, they establish themselves, and it's longevity there.
The Macedonians, especially the Seleucids, they strike me as having never been anything more than a very thin crust of soldiers, rulers, officials over a mass of people, the civilian population, that was neither Macedonian or Greek. I would think that, therefore, that the states were themselves much more fragile, since it was really just a ruling elite. When we think about these armies and the various kings we talk about, it was a ruling elite doing a battle against other ruling elites, such as the Ptolemies. Which
in turn would make the mass of as we said earlier, the mass of your troops not necessarily reliable.
If they were even inducted into the army, you wondered just how much of the population was really available for military service in any sense. Would they put weapons into the hands of non-Macedonians if they could avoid it?
I think they're forced to in the end. But I mean, coming back to in terms of the loyalty, I mean, the perfect example of how loyal are Macedonian troops is when you get into the Silver Shields, and when they are fighting for Eumenes, finally they lose their baggage, of course, and their reaction is their baggage is more important than their commanding officer, and so they sell their commanding officer in return for their baggage.
And the Silver Shields were Macedonians, but Eumenes was a Greek, and they turned him over.
But still, I mean, he's as much a Macedonian as some of them. I mean, by that stage, I mean, when we're talking about Macedonians, even amongst those, we're still talking about the different tribes of Macedon, which, even especially in Philip's time, but even by the time that Alexander leaves for his campaigns, Macedon isn't necessarily a unified place. It's still a sort of a loose alliance of the different original tribes. that make up the upper and lower Macedon in terms of their allegiance states.
Should we maintain a distinction between Macedonians and Greeks this far into the period, because it seemed to have been very important in Alexander's day. They would have at a game. They had games in which a Macedonian and a Greek warrior fought each other. All the soldiers took sides. But by Antiochus's time, was that a distinction, or was it really just all people who were Greek in language and culture, wherever they were, and that was the actual important factor?
I think it was largely Hellenized by then. As such, I don't think there was a real fundamental difference between Macedonians and Greeks as such, and especially not to the Romans, who all considered them all Greeks anyway. You see that when they conquer, when they add Egypt, for example, to the empire, to the Romans, they're all Egyptians, but amongst themselves they differentiate between Greeks and native Egyptians, so ones that also speak Egyptian, and the ones that are Greek identify themselves as Greek, even though, as far as genetics are concerned, there is no hard and fast. There are no hard and fast rules. The ones that identify as Greek speak the Greek language, take part in gymnasia, have symposia or whatever, whereas the Egyptians don't. They adhere to their own customs that they say are handed down from generation to generation. So it's by the time that happens in the 1st century BC, there is basically a divide between Greek and, in quotes again, natives. As such, the Greeks are still sort of seen as these outsiders to some extent, but a distinction between Macedonians and Greeks, I don't think really exists. Certainly not outside of the Aegean, I guess, in the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic kingdom, from maybe the 2nd century BC onwards or something. I would guess.
I'd agree that in terms of the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, certainly I don't think there would be a distinction between the two, but certainly still in the Aegean, especially mainland Greece, the Athenians, for example, I think they would be pointing out a very big difference.
Definitely.
I mean, even I think maybe if you took something from their perspective still, I think they would be distinguishing between the different Greek and Macedonian elements of an army if they were to examine it as such. But I think, in terms of the wider world, it's more the Macedonian name has taken over in terms of armies.
Now, if you're looking in Greece in the Hellenistic period, Sparta, for example, still tries to, at one point, I'm not exactly sure when in the Hellenistic period, whether it's the 2nd century BC or it's still in the 3rd, I don't know, they really try to latch onto their supposed traditions, so they try to reform Sparta in the image of, as Lycurgus supposedly had handed it down as a militarized state, etc., etc. They consciously, return to that tradition and say this is what makes us Spartans. So you can see that even in a Greece that is ostensibly a single kingdom ruled from Macedon, you still have the individual. What used to be the individual city-states clinging to their local traditions. So certainly within the Aegean, whether you were Macedonian or Athenian or Spartan or Corinthian or Theban, there would have been a major difference. Whereas in the conquered areas, it might not have been such a large difference, because basically it would have been it's us Greeks with our Greek culture against these, or living above or beside, or however you want to say it, among these peoples that are not Greek as such, and that would have been a difference, and that would have homogenized the Greek element in those areas outside of the Aegean, outside of the area where the Greek history is much deeper, let's say.
Well, I think we'll leave things there. I'd like to thank Josho, Marc and Marc. For more information on the magazine, go to ancient-warfare.com. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.